Aboriginal society is a very ancient society. We have archaeological evidence for at least 40,000 years and some other evidence for as much as 50 or 60,000 years, although that's not as clear. Aboriginal people arrived in Australia at a time when the world really was starting to expand, human populations were moving around, and they came to a country that had virtually none of the attributes of the countries they had left. They came from the Southeast Asian region, where there were much in the way of foods, plant foods and animal foods, and the animals there were an entirely different type. They were placental mammals, and they came to Australia where only really marsupial mammals existed. There were one or two placental mammals, bats and seals, but very little. So they had to develop a very, very rigid form of society that allowed them to both adopt the country and adapt to the country and to sustain themselves. So they had very strict marriage rules, they had very strict ceremonial rules, and they developed 4 key elements, and those key elements really underpin all Aboriginal society today. The first of those elements is reciprocity. In the slides that you're seeing, you see 2 men fighting, one man clearly dominating the other. He's on the front foot, he's coming over the top of the other man, and he's knocking him to the ground. The other man is falling back on his back foot, and clearly the fight is very one-sided at this point. Aboriginal people recognise the importance and value of payback, and they recognise the importance and value of reciprocity. Reciprocity demands that for every action taken towards a person, there must be an equal reaction from that person. So if someone was to do you a good deed or a favour, or to train you in some aspect of life, then it is your responsibility to repay them either by supplying food or learning their story and carrying their story forward. So reciprocity is very important in those regards. When it comes to physical reactions, if someone takes an action against you physically, in other words attacks you or injures you, you are bound under Aboriginal law to take a response action against that person. You must take that action in a very, very specialised and formalised way, but it's important that you do take that action. If you were not to take that action, your community around you would take action for you, and then you would come under punishment for that, for not taking an action. So that's reciprocity. Our second element is sustainability and conservation. Now, Aboriginal society is very interesting in that they very well understand the conservative nature of the world. In other words, you must maintain the world in a way that sustains you, and they take an active role, a dynamic role in their conservation, and we've come to call that dynamic conservation or sustainable conservation. Now, how does this work? Well, how it works is that you choose a campsite that has water with it, sometimes plant foods, and it's associated with other forms of food support. So it might be a good fishing spot. Certainly you have to have water, shelter, and some other food source. Having developed and got that campsite going, over the next many generations, you will work on that campsite. You bring seeds back to that campsite in the fruits that you gather. You bring tubers back to that campsite in the tubers and roots that you gather. You eat those foods and you defecate the residual of those foods out around the edges of your campsite. So eventually your campsite becomes surrounded by plants and vegetables and fruits brought there by you and planted by your actions in defecation. When you're finished with your campsite each year, you burn it off, you clean it out, you clean up the country. And by cleaning up the country, you create fresh green grass, so that next year when you come back to that campsite, You've got the enhanced fruits and berries and other vegetable foods, and you've now got an enhanced grassy area where animals will come to forage. So you've created virtually your own little hunting park. So it's a very clever method of conserving your local environment, but creating a sustainable conservation in your local environment. Our next element in the Aboriginal society is mentoring, and that comes as part of the gerontocratic rule in this society. Aboriginal society says that everyone is equal, it's an egalitarian society, but that old men, the gerontocrats, and old women are the holders of knowledge, and those old men and old women pass their knowledge on by mentoring the young men and young women under them. So for every action you take, whether it to be grinding ochre for a painting or for body paints or for a ceremony, or for dancing a ceremony or singing a song, making a spear, making a boomerang, hunting, every single aspect of your life would be guided by your elder, your gerontocratic ruler, and your mentor, and that may be well the same person, or it may be a number of people who have specialist crafts. Gerontocracy works through old men accumulating knowledge, and by that accumulation of knowledge become respected as elders and become leaders of the community by the knowledge and wisdom they hold. Well, a young man coming up may be gone through his first initiation, where his uncle would have guided him through the process of being cut and marked as an initiated man in the first stages. That young boy would be taken by his uncle or by the mentor assigned to him to a special location where ceremonies and dances would be performed in the particular category of training that this young man is to undergo. One of the things I'm thinking about is there is a site nearby to where I live where young men would be taken and shown how to spear animals, how to hunt kangaroos. Now, in European society, a young boy might be given a rifle on his 15th or 16th birthday, and he will simply go out and start shooting. That would never happen in Aboriginal society. In Aboriginal society, a young man might be taught on how to make a spear, and then when he's proficient in making and throwing that spear, he would be taken to a site where he would be inducted into the art of kangaroo hunting, and he would be shown how to hunt the kangaroo, how to sneak up on the kangaroo. He would be given information on all of the activities of kangaroos, the life and style and social setup of kangaroos. So young men would become so proficient in the knowledge of kangaroos that they would be almost certain of always getting a kangaroo when they go hunting. So their technology is simple, but their knowledge of country and their knowledge of animal behaviour is exceedingly deep. I remember when I was at university, we were actually shown some very old 8mm film of an old man teaching a young man how to hunt kangaroos. And the thing that amazed me was that the filming was taken over the shoulder of the old man as he threw his spear. And to me, and to the camera angle, it appeared that he had thrown the spear some 10 metres away from the kangaroo. But the amazing thing was that the spear, as it travelled through the air, exactly met the kangaroo, who had chosen a certain path to run that intersected with the spear's flight. And so that old man's knowledge of which way the kangaroo would run was crucial to his successful spearing of the kangaroo. The time the spear took to travel the 30 metres that it was thrown was exactly the amount of time that it took for the kangaroo to run to the point where the spear was going to land. Truly, it was an amazing thing to see how accurate and how clever these old men were and how they passed on that knowledge. The orca, the killer whale, is my totem, it's my country totem. I've adopted the orca because my role in my community is a lawgiver. I give the law and I talk the law to my community. I make sure that stories are told in the right way. I make sure that drawings and engravings are interpreted in the correct way. So the orca, the killer whale, has become my country totem. Now, the orca has a particular role in society, and that is of the bringer of the law. And how does the orca do that? Well, when the blossoms on the wattle first appear in late September, Aboriginal people, especially the owner of the orca totem, would be required to send young people up to a lookout to look out for the appearance of orca as they come up the coast. Orca come along the coastline because at that time of the year is when we have the most seals, the most dolphins and porpoises, and the first appearances of whales calving along our coastline. What orcas do is drive those seals, those porpoises and dolphins, and those calves, those whale calves, into the shallows of the bay where I live, and force them into the shallows where they become trapped and beached. The job of the young person who's been placed up onto the lookout is to call out to the community. It's usually a high promontory, and he calls out, or she calls out, in a particular way, in a high-pitched yell, Yahweh! And that alerts the locals living in the bays and in estuaries around there that something is happening in the bay. And they all flock down to the bay where either some seals have been driven ashore, or a porpoise or dolphin has been driven ashore, or if they're very lucky, the whale calf has been driven ashore, or even occasionally the whale itself might be driven ashore. When they see that, the people fall upon the carcass of the animal, whichever it is, and they harvest the carcass. Usually a seal weighing maybe 300 or 400 kilograms will feed a dozen people or 20 people for more than a week. If it's a whale, it might feed 20, 30, even up to 100 people for a number of weeks, up to 4 or 5 weeks. Usually the thing that stops the feeding is that the whale meat becomes so putrid and so smelly and noisome that people simply move away from it to get away from the smell. But once the whale is driven ashore, or the porpoise or the seal is driven ashore, then the people harvest that. They take out the soft parts and they feed them to the orca, which is now patrolling offshore in the deep channels around the shallow area. The orca know that they're going to be fed, and so every year they do this action, and they are fed by the people. In this story, as the orca hunting in the bay drive the prey animals in front of them, quite often they come ashore in their efforts to kill or feed on the prey animals. And Aboriginal people saw that where the orcas came ashore as an effort of Gurrawal to revert to his human spirit form and to come on shore in that human spirit form. And it is at that point that this becomes the law-giving element and moves away from the law-bringing element, because now that whale spirit, that Gurrawal whale human spirit, now transforms into a human and starts to control what is going on in the ceremonies and in the activities of the Aboriginal people. And as this goes on, and the whale spirit, Gurrawal, the whale spirit, becomes more and more powerful, he starts to dominate the community completely, directing men in their ceremonies, directing women in their behaviours, and other elements of his spirit start to emerge. One of the elements of the whale spirit is that he brings ashore with him the enormous spirit penis that the orca have, and that leads him to having a predilection towards women, and the whale spirit, the Gurrawal spirit, is seen as a womanizer, a woman chaser, and he takes women for his wives, but as his power grows, he takes other men's wives to his bed as well, and this causes great animosity and anger. As his power grows more and more, and as the food from the beached animals starts to decline, his power now starts to be corrupted. He's very powerful, but the food's starting to fall off. People are starting to be angry with him. And so now he starts to move from camp to camp, and as a trick against those people, he often declares the food sacred. Only he can eat it. So he will come into a camp and he'll see the fish or the meat being roasted on the fire, and he will call out, "Maran, Maran," and that means sacred food, and he will declare the food sacred and start to eat that food and control the whole lifestyle of the people. And of course the people now really are starting to object to his behaviour and his corruption. Finally, this predation on the food and on their wives and the unmarried girls becomes so great that the community rebel, and young men gather together and spear and kill him, and they kill his wives, the young girls that have gone off with him as well, because they have committed an offence by going off with him. So once he is speared and is returned to the ground, then his spirit flies back into the body of the orca and is ready to reappear and to redo the ceremonies. In this slide we see a depiction from Arnhem Land of the whale story, only here we see it depicted in another way. One of the things that is very, very obvious to people doing work in this area is that these stories have carriage throughout Australia. These stories can be representative and that their characters can change, but the general theme, the general importance of the story remains the same. This painting from Arnhem Land in this slide is very, very interesting. This demonstrates, I think, very clearly that this story of the law-giving spirit moves throughout Australia. We've seen paintings from Arnhem Land. We could find paintings in the centre of Australia, and now we find paintings extending all the way up to the Gulf country and into the Torres Strait. Always the story remains the same, the impact remains the same, but the characters change. It is the outcomes that are the same. In my area, in my story, the whale spirit comes ashore, does its ceremonies, directs the men, dominates the women, usurps the food, and also is ritually slaughtered at the end of each cycle. In this slide, I'd first like to start off by acknowledging Tex Scewthorpe, an elder from the Bawarrina area, and acknowledge his vast knowledge of Aboriginal law. In this area where I live, very much like the area around Bawarrina, the stories have multiple layers. First up, it's clear that people will see paintings, engravings and drawings from time to time in their daily lives, and it's important that there is a layer for the general community to understand. Otherwise people would be puzzled and worried about what those meanings are. And so we might say that this is the general layer, the very basic layer of simply talking about a kangaroo or a whale or a spirit figure. In the next layer, where a young man or a young woman is first introduced into the pathway to become an expert in their field, a warrior for a young man and a resource manager for a young woman, a woman who will become so prolific and so profoundly knowledgeable about the environment that she will be able to maintain herself, her children, and supply a vast amount of food for her husband. For the young man who will learn all of the attributes of the animals and fish that he will hunt and gather, and to such an extent that he will be able to predict behaviours and have the very minimum amount of impact on the environment because he will know how well they are. And then at other layers you will learn about the elements of the spiritual nature of these drawings and paintings and engravings. And the spiritual nature is where layers fragment, because as the owner of a dreaming, I must know not only all of the layers, but the layers that interconnect with other stories. You need to know only the basics as a child or as an uninitiated person. You need to know the meanings as an initiated person, and then as you go through those various layers of initiation, into adulthood, you need to find out the other elements so that the whole of the environment, the whole of the world becomes clear to you. Remember, these people are dealing with something imponderable and quite often very difficult to guess or manipulate. So it's crucial that these stories are finely detailed and packed with information and technology. I know as a young man, when I was first taught a dreaming story, I was given the very basics of that dreaming story. I was given the 100 emu dreaming story about how emus came into the desert country and how they spread throughout Australia and how they used water holes to move through the country. This story was clearly told to me, not so that I would necessarily understand how emus move around, but rather how it was possible to move through the desert by having a clear knowledge of water holes and being able to move from water hole to water hole and therefore become part of the environment rather than an element fighting against the environment.